All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this podcast Q&A session brought to you by Piccolo Podcasts. I'm Andrew Menzel, founder and lead producer at Piccolo Podcasts. I've also got Holly Mitchell producing this broadcast, who is my co-producer at Piccolo Podcasts and does fantastic work. Couldn't do anything without her. So the way this is, I've got, but if you want to ask questions, you can comment on the Instagram live video or you can comment on the YouTube. If you comment on Twitter, we probably won't see it. So if you want to ask a question, jump on our YouTube page, probably the best way to do that. And we'll be answering all the questions as they come up. I've got a lot I want to talk about with podcasting. I've also got one question already that came in before we started from Cara Watt. Now, she asks, my question, this is from her, is how to help your clients that have more than one speciality work on their podcast content plan for the year. So they have more than one speciality that they want to feature in the podcast. Take me as an example, says Cara. I talk about brand marketing, digital strategy, well-being at work, and communication. So when you have a content idea like this, where you want to touch on lots of different things, I would suggest you look at the podcast less like a podcast show and more like a podcast channel. So the podcast becomes a channel in which you can put out shows that deal with these topics individually. And that way, if it's all in one nice channel, it's very easy for you to build, or it's easier for you to build an audience and then connect with the people that want the content, rather than starting, say, 4 different podcasts and then you have to build up 4 different audiences. Because, if this is coming from a business or a brand, a lot of people will be interested in all the facets of content that you're putting out and all the stuff. So if you treat it as a channel, then you should get good results. I would then, though, labeling each release very clearly. People can want work stuff, but they don't want to listen to the brand marketing. Make it really clear for the listeners and subscribers to the podcast channel which is which. So that's the way I go when you've got a strategy like that, where you've got lots of different things that you want to push out on the one podcast feed. View it as a channel, and that way the listeners can pick and choose which topics they want to listen to. So look, I've got a few things I want to talk about with podcasting. The first one is what you should go into podcast, what sort of plan you should take into podcasting. Because I have a lot of people come to Piccolo Podcasts and they think that inviting one of their friends, chatting about stuff, is going to be a good podcast. And 99.9% of the time, that won't be any good for the listener. You might have a nice chat. Interesting, probably not. You really want to think about who you're talking to and why are they listening, and try and provide some value in terms of, if someone's spending their time, then they're going to get something back, whether that's entertainment, whether that's knowledge, whether that's enjoyment, like lots of little things. But you can't just think that, if I invite one of my friends in and we talk about their life, that's going to be great. If you want to do something like that, then you have to really think about who's going to listen, the structure of the interview, and have a real plan. So you might want to talk about certain themes in every show, but you've really got to narrow it down so your audience has a reason to come to the show. And one of the things with podcasts at the moment is there are lots of them. There are millions of podcasts out there. So you really want to make it not just compelling, but you want to make sure you clearly define what you podcasts produce for some huge audience and more about branding. So you really want to think about why you're going into it, and don't just think that, okay, if we just start talking, that's going to be a podcast, because That's not going to work. That rarely works. It needs to be more than that. So then, you want to think about, why are you doing the podcast? Is the podcast a funnel into your other income streams? Do you have products that you sell? Do you offer services? As an individual, are you a consultant or a mentor, or all types? Are you an entrepreneur? All those types of things. You got to think about why you're doing it, because podcasts can be really good for funneling people into your other business streams. They can also be a way of adding value to people that already use your services or subscribers. So there's a lot of different reasons to do it. Another one can be to, entertain. So you want to build an audience, and then, have a big audience that comes to the show for entertainment. So there are lots of different reasons why you can go into podcasting. Personal branding is a really big one. Personal development, actually working on a podcast, interviewing people, seeing that process through is great for personal development, because there are all types of things you can do. All facets of the podcast will help your development. The planning of the interviews, interviewing someone, the networking that comes with that, and then afterwards, the post production and editing, and even if you've got a producer doing this, doing a podcast will be great for personal development. They can, make your public speaking skills. If you want to meet someone, coffee, but if you want to get them on your podcast, that's a lot more a nicer offer. So I would think, when you go a podcast, you really want to be clear about why you're going into it, and have a real plan. And I often say to people, if you're not sure about podcasting, do a limited season. Say I'm going to do 10 episodes, for example, and then I'm going to see how I go. And then you can assess after 10 episodes. Don't overpromise. Don't say, I'm going to do a podcast once a week for the next year, and then after 10 weeks, you're sick of it, or you want a break. So going with a plan, talk to someone like me who can guide you through the process. But as I said, you've really got to think carefully about the content you produce now. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, if you wanted to start a podcast, you could just maybe do something a bit different, but now that's all been done. There's so many podcasts out there that you really want to have a well-developed plan, a well-developed idea. You want slick production. It's got to sound good. So yeah, there's some of the things. I often think podcasts for people spoke about. If you're a business brand, if you're a business or a brand, podcasts can really add some compelling marketing to your social media and your marketing channels, because from a podcast you can get lots of great bits of content, whether that's audio clips, quote tiles. You can write articles for LinkedIn. You can write blogs. I mean, there's so much that can come out of a podcast for a business or a brand. So you should really think about that, adding a podcast to your marketing if you're a business or a brand looking to do something a bit different. Podcasting has a deep connection with the audience. So especially if you are an established brand, it'll be easier to build an audience, and you'll find that people connect with the brand if you're producing that kind of content, longer form, insightful content, and also you're adding some sort of depth to your business personality. You're adding a bit behind it. People will know more what you're about. So that's where it can work for businesses or brands. And look, that podcasts can work in many different other facets. Individually, for example, I started a cricket podcast, a long time ago, but it's led to lots of other great stuff along the way, cricket commentary, all types of stuff. So, there are lots of ways a podcast can benefit your development. And as I said, you just can't go into it thinking, oh, I'm just going to be chatting and this is going to be great, because that's probably not going to cut it. Technical stuff. Wow, podcasting is great because there's lots of different ways you can record, and a lot of them are pretty good. But I would suggest work really hard on having good quality sound, because you need to sort of hit a certain level, so people don't just switch it off straight away. So, you know, the Rodecaster Pro we use for a lot of stuff at Piccolo Podcast. That's a great sort of all-in-one system, but you know that might not be affordable for some people out there. So you can just buy a USB mic, like a Blue Yeti USB mic that I've got right here, and plug that into a computer, and that gets really good sound. It's I think $150 Australian for a Blue Yeti mic. So there's lots of ways of recording podcasts, and it sort of does depend on your budget and how much time you've got. But you know, a simple USB mic will do it. If you want to start, for example, we're using StreamYard now to broadcast this Q&A session. StreamYard's a good way of connecting with people online and recording. So Zoom, everyone's got so much better at using Zoom since COVID. So that's a good way of recording podcasts. And then, yeah, as I said, you can end up going down a rabbit hole of microphones, and you can spend lots of money on fancy setups. But yeah, you just want to. Phone does pretty. You can record you on an iPhone, but you need 10 sound wise minimum. People can get used to a little bit lower quality, so it doesn't have to be 10 out of 10 all the time. But you just want to make sure people are going to be able to hear it and understand what you're saying, because that's pretty important in a podcast. And then, you know, a lot of people think once you release the podcast, thousands of people are going to listen. You really have to work hard to, once a podcast is released, you need to do a lot of social media marketing. You want to hammer your network. So if you've got a social following, all your friends, your family, you really want to make sure all those people know about your show. If you've got a mailing list, that's a great thing to utilize. Send it out on a mailing list. But you just want to make sure that you're using your network to support the podcast, because that's the great start. You need a little seed to plant, and then you hope it'll grow. But you want your network to support the show, and that'll help maybe get you up in the charts, and other people will see it. So yeah, there's lots of work once you've released. It's good to have an advertising budget. So think about if you want to spend on social media, boosting posts about the podcast. So Instagram can drive listeners. If you were to boost podcast posts on your Instagram feed, and you can target your audience there, which is pretty good for your show. And then you can start to grow your audience. So you do think about a marketing budget. Yeah, social media advertising is probably a good place. But yeah, it's not just going to happen once you hit release on the show. It's not just going to all of a sudden start being in front of people. So yeah, really think about spending some money and getting people to and using your network. And then this sort of moves on to the next thing about sort of, you know, I'm hearing from a lot of podcasters that their listeners aren't growing the way they would like. And this is a common problem at the moment. Even the biggest networks are finding this, that the fact is there are millions of shows out there, and you're competing for people's ear time. You know, for example, I subscribe to 150 podcasts, but I don't listen to all of them. I sort of pick and choose, and sometimes a podcast I really like might come up, but you know, I end up listening to other stuff, and then you just don't get around to it. It's not because I don't like the show or I don't think it's good, but it's just a time thing. So really don't be put off by low listenership. You just have to spend the time building your audience. It's a slow build, and does take years, it can be, to build an audience sometimes. And then, you know, if you think about that, sort of working back, if people are, short on time, make sure as a podcast producer, you're really valuing their time. Honestly, it doesn't take 2 minutes to get into a bloody episode. I hate that you turn on an podcast, there's an ad, then there's an intro, then there's another intro, then there's the host just chatting for a minute or two. That's all bullshit. Value your listeners' time and get straight into it. And then if you've got an interview that's an hour and a half, if 55 minutes of it is really strong, cut out the other 35 minutes. You can do, I often on my shows will, and you can have a full fan and eventually put that, people can subscribe to it and pay for that extra content, but value your listeners' time, especially now because it's so competitive that people just won't finish them. They won't come back. So you need slick production. And as I said, just don't waste people's time. If you're lucky enough to have sponsorships, that's great. Do the ad, get into your show. Host-read ads are really valuable. People love them. Advertisers love them. Listeners don't mind them. So by all means, put them in your show, but make sure you keep your show moving so people have a reason not to just turn off and listen to the next podcast that pops up in their feed. So that's where you will see value in going to a production house like Piccolo Podcast, because we can give you all this expertise, because you can spend hours and days, months researching the best way to do a podcast, the best way to record it, or the marketing and stuff. So if you've got time to do that, fantastic. But if you don't, ask Piccolo Podcast. We can guide you through this process to make it easier for you, because there's a lot of little things along the way to be aware of. For example, what hosting platform should you use? So the way a podcast works is you put it in a central location, and then it is fed to all the apps like Apple, Spotify, Google, you name it. So we use Omni Studio for most of our podcasts, but there are different hosts, and some of them might suit you better for what you're doing. So it's really important to consider those decisions before you take the leap. And we can help you with that. I've ins and outs and what. All right. Well, that was it for the Piccolo Podcast Q&A. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll be doing another one of these soon.